God help the poor soul who marries you. He said it in front of everyone, a room full of England's finest silk and silver and cold watching eyes. And she didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She looked that proud, powerful landowner straight in the face and said something that silenced every last one of them. 3 months later, he married her. And that man, that cold, arrogant soul who pitied her, would spend the rest of his life thanking God he did. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who later needed you most, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay close, because this one runs deep. The morning of the Hargrove dinner party. Sophia Sinclair pressed her one good gown between two damp cloths and prayed the wrinkles would surrender before evening. They did not. She wore it anyway. The Hargrove estate sat 6 miles east of the village of Aldenmere, Kent, and on a clear October night in 1816, every carriage in the county seemed to be headed toward its gates. Sophia rode with her mother and her younger sister in a hired coach that smelled of wet wool and old leather, its wheels catching every rut in the road with enthusiastic cruelty. Her mother, Margaret Sinclair, sat across from her with the rigid posture of a woman who had once known better days and intended to perform them for as long as breath remained in her body. "Sit straight, Sophia." "I am sitting straight." "You are sitting the way you sit when you are thinking too hard about something that doesn't concern you." Sophia turned her face to the window. The darkness outside offered nothing, but it was preferable to the alternative. The Hargrove dinner was not in truth a dinner. It was a presentation. The Hargroves had 2 unmarried daughters of their own, and hosting a gathering of Kent's eligible gentlemen was their annual contribution to the county's matrimonial economy. Every woman who attended understood the terms. Every man who attended understood them better. Frederick Pembroke would be there. That was the piece of information that had traveled through the village like a lit fuse, igniting speculation in every parlor and sitting room within 10 miles. Frederick Pembroke, heir to Pembroke Hall, master of 4,000 acres, possessor of a fortune that older men spoke of with a reverence usually reserved for Scripture, had announced through his solicitor Mr. Aldridge that he intended to consider the matter of marriage before the year's end. Consider the matter. As though a wife were a drainage improvement. Sophia had heard this news the way she heard most news, quietly from the corner of a room, while other women reacted with the appropriate breathlessness. She had nodded. She had returned to the household accounts she was reviewing for her mother. She had not allowed herself a single flutter of anticipation. That had been 2 weeks ago. She was still not fluttering. The coach lurched to a stop before the Hargroves' lit entrance, and Sophia descended behind her mother with the practiced economy of a woman who had long since stopped expecting a hand to be offered. Inside the house was warm and too bright and crowded with exactly the kind of people Sophia had spent the last 3 years learning to move through without drawing notice. She accepted a glass of wine she did not intend to drink and positioned herself near the window that overlooked the east garden, where the cold air pressed thin fingers through the imperfect seal of the glass and reminded her agreeably that the world was larger than this room. She was watching the frost collect on the lower pane when she heard him. Not his voice. Not yet. She heard the silence that preceded him, the particular quality of stillness that fell over a room when someone of genuine consequence entered it. Conversations didn't stop exactly. They redirected, like water finding a new channel. Sophia turned. Frederick Pembroke was taller than she'd expected. She had seen him once at a distance on horseback crossing the north road near the mill. She had thought then that he moved the way wealthy men learn to move, as though the ground beneath them was already owned. Up close, the impression deepened rather than softened. His jaw was the kind that suggested decisions made and not revisited. His eyes, dark, level, unhurried, moved across the room the way a man surveys land he is considering purchasing. How was accompanied by 2 other gentlemen whose names Sophia did not know and whose faces she did not bother to catalogue. They moved in his orbit the way lesser planets did present, but fundamentally decorative. "That is him," her sister Eleanor breathed, materializing at Sophia's elbow with the sudden enthusiasm of a 19-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend otherwise. "He is exactly as—" "He is a man at a dinner party," Sophia said. "Lower your voice, Ellie. You're the one staring." "I was looking at the frost on the window." "The window is behind you." Sophia took a small sip of her wine and said nothing. The evening proceeded in its predictable architecture. Dinner, then the drawing room, then the invisible rearrangement of bodies that constituted the social ritual of introduction. Mrs. Hargrove, a woman of magnificent determination, personally guided Frederick Pembroke through the assembled guests with the focus of a general moving troops. Sophia watched from a comfortable distance as he was presented to the Hargrove daughters, both of whom smiled with the luminous precision of long practice, and then to the Ashton sisters from Maidstone, and then to the widow Calloway, who was young and very rich, and made absolutely no effort to conceal either fact. How was polite to all of them. Politely absent. Present in body, nowhere near present in attention. Sophia recognized the quality. She had seen it in men who were fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing a desire. He was here because his solicitor and his sense of duty had conspired to place him here, and he was moving through the required motions with the efficiency of someone who intended to survive the evening and return to more pressing concerns in the morning. She felt unexpectedly a small needle of sympathy for him. She did not intend to speak to him. There was no particular reason why she should. She was not one of the featured candidates of the evening. The Sinclair name still carried a certain weight in Kent. Her grandfather had been a man of substance, but her father's decline had been thorough and well documented, and everyone in the room knew that Sophia Sinclair brought no fortune, no connections, and no acreage to the matrimonial table. She brought herself. And the room had rendered its verdict on what that was worth. It was Mrs. Hargrove who undid the comfortable distance. "Miss Sinclair." The woman materialized at Sophia's side with the inevitability of weather. "You simply must meet Mr. Pembroke. He was asking after your family just a moment ago." He was not asking after her family. Sophia was quite certain of this. But she allowed herself to be steered across the room with the grace of a woman who understood that resistance in a drawing room was both undignified and futile. Frederick Pembroke turned as they approached. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had thought. They moved to her face with the same measured quality she had noticed from across the room, assessing, calibrating, arriving at a conclusion with uncomfortable speed. "Mr. Pembroke," Mrs. Hargrove announced with the satisfaction of a woman completing a project, "may I present Miss Sophia Sinclair of the Aldenmere Sinclairs." "Miss Sinclair." His voice was low, the kind that didn't need volume to carry. "Mr. Pembroke." Mrs. Hargrove melted away with the professional discretion of a woman who had done this many times and knew exactly when to disappear. A brief silence opened between them. "I understand your family's estate is near the northern ridge," Frederick said. A conversational gambit, the standard kind. "What remains of it?" Sophia replied. "Not bitterness, just accuracy. The eastern fields were sold after my father's death. The house is still standing, which is more than most people expected." His eyes shifted slightly. Not discomfort exactly, more the quality of a man recalibrating. "I'm sorry for your loss. It was 3 years ago. I've made my peace with it." "Have you?" It wasn't quite a question. It landed in the air between them with a different quality, not challenging exactly, but not accepting either. As though he was genuinely uncertain. "Yes," Sophia said. The alternative seemed unproductive. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one perhaps quickly suppressed. They spoke for several minutes after that, about the harvest, about the road conditions between Aldenmere and Maidstone, about a matter of disputed water rights that had occupied the county magistrate for the better part of the summer. He spoke about land with the fluency of a man who thought about it constantly. She matched him point for point, because she had spent the last 3 years managing what remained of her family's property, and had learned more about soil composition, drainage, and tenancy agreements than she had ever expected to need. He noticed. She could see him noticing. And that was when Mrs. Ashton made her contribution to the evening. The woman had been hovering at the periphery of their conversation. For some minutes, her 2 daughters arranged behind her like a small regiment awaiting deployment. She inserted herself into the pause between sentences with the precision of long practice. "Mr. Pembroke, you simply must forgive us for interrupting. But my daughter Charlotte has such a particular question about the Pembroke estate's reputation for pheasant." "Charlotte, don't be shy." "Charlotte." Ashton stepped forward with the obedient grace of a woman who had been positioned for this moment for several years. She was lovely. Sophia noted this with perfect equanimity. Lovely and well-connected, and the possessor of a dowry that the entire county could have quoted from memory. Frederick began to turn, and Mrs. Ashton, having secured the pivot, did what women of her particular breed sometimes did when they felt a rival needed to be managed. She looked at Sophia with a smile that contained nothing warm, and said in the carrying tone of a woman accustomed to drawing rooms' good acoustics, "Of course one does wonder what Mr. Pembroke makes of our Miss Sinclair's ambitions, advising on estate matters. So very," a pause perfectly timed, unusual for a young lady in her position. The room didn't go entirely silent, but the conversations in their immediate vicinity developed a sudden, attentive quality. Frederick had half-turned. He stopped. Sophia kept her chin exactly level. It was another woman, Lady Fenwick, 63 years old and in possession of a social position that made her opinions functionally sovereign, who chose that precise moment to contribute her own observation from across the small circle that had formed around them. Well, she'd need to advise on something, wouldn't she? God help the poor soul who'd have to marry into that situation. A ripple of amusement moved through the circle. Delicate. The kind of laughter that pretended it was about nothing in particular. And then Frederick Pembroke turned fully back toward Sophia. She watched his face, watched him take in the situation with those level assessing eyes, watched the small calculation happen, and then watched him make his choice. God help the poor soul who marries you. His voice was quiet, not cruel. The delivery was almost conversational. But every person within hearing distance caught every word, and the room understood what had happened. He had aligned himself. He had chosen a side, and the side he had chosen was not hers. The silence that followed was the particular kind that precedes either a flood or a fire. Sophia felt the heat climb her throat. She felt the familiar sting behind her eyes that she had trained herself over 3 years of grief and reduction and unwanted pity to absolutely refuse. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room settle on her. The way stones settle, heavy, inevitable, accumulating. She could have smiled, excused herself, moved away with the quiet grace of a woman absorbing an injury without displaying it, which was the accepted and expected response. She had been absorbing injuries without displaying them for 3 years. She looked at Frederick Pembroke. I was watching her. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read, not triumph, not cruelty. Something more like the detached curiosity of a man who had thrown a stone into water and was waiting to observe the pattern of the ripples. He was waiting to see what she would do. She held his gaze for one full, steady breath. Then perhaps God should help the man, Sophia said, and her voice was entirely level, carrying with perfect clarity into the attentive silence. Who believes a wife is only valuable when she is convenient. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Frederick Pembroke's expression did something she did not expect. It didn't harden. It didn't flush. It shifted in the way that things shift when a door opens unexpectedly in a familiar wall, revealing a room that had no right to be there. He looked at her. Not through her. Not past her. At her. Miss Sinclair. His voice had a quality she couldn't name. Mr. Pembroke. She dipped her chin, not a bow, not a curtsy, but the acknowledgement of one equal to another, and turned and walked away through the parted crowd with her spine straight and her hands completely steady. She found the window with the frost and stood there until her heartbeat returned to something her ribs could tolerate. Eleanor appeared at her elbow within 60 seconds. Sophia. Her sister's voice had dropped to the barely there register she used when she was genuinely alarmed. What, just Sophia? That was Frederick Pembroke. Yes. You said that to Frederick Pembroke. I said what was accurate. Sophia. Eleanor caught her arm. People don't speak to him like that. Someone should. A pause. You're trembling. I'm cold. The window is drafty. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then quietly. It was brilliant, you know. What you said. It was honest. There's a difference. Sophia did not look back across the room. She was almost certain she was not being observed anymore, and she preferred to maintain that particular certainty. The alternative that he was watching, that those dark assessing eyes were still directed toward the window, toward the woman in the pressed gown with the frost-fogged glass, was a consideration she had no practical use for. She was wrong about not being observed. Frederick Pembroke stood with his glass untouched at his side and watched Sophia Sinclair's reflection in the far window for a long time. He told himself on the drive home through the dark Kent lanes that she was impertinent. He told himself this twice, which was 2 more times than he typically needed to tell himself anything. He told himself that a woman who spoke that way in company, who answered a social correction with a public counterattack, was precisely the kind of woman that rational men avoided. He told himself that her composure had been a kind of performance, and that performances, however skillfully executed, were fundamentally dishonest. He told himself that he had not in any meaningful sense been affected. He fell asleep before he reached Pembroke Hall, which was unusual. He dreamed of nothing he could remember. He woke with the particular irritability of a man who suspects he has arrived at an answer he does not yet have a question for. He ate breakfast alone, as he preferred. He reviewed the morning correspondence from his steward, Mr. Croft, which contained its usual catalogue of matters requiring attention: a disputed boundary line on the Thornwick parcel, a request from 3 tenant families regarding the Northfield drainage, a reminder about the quarterly accounts. He read it all with the focused attention that had always been one of his most reliable qualities. He could not have told anyone afterward what any of it said. He made inquiries about the Sinclairs. This was not, he told himself, a remarkable thing. He made inquiries about any number of families. It was simply good practice. What he learned was this: Arthur Sinclair had been until his death 3 years prior a man of moderate prosperity and considerably immoderate spending habits. The Sinclair estate, not large but respectable, had been maintained through his lifetime on the strength of inherited capital that he had systematically failed to replenish. When he died, he left behind a wife, 2 daughters, a house with a leaking roof on the north wing, and debts that had required the sale of the eastern and southern fields to address. The estate that remained was perhaps 120 acres, most of it productive. It was by every account significantly better managed now than it had been under its late master. By whom was it managed? By the elder daughter, Miss Sophia Sinclair, 27 years old, no formal training, self-educated apparently through a combination of her late father's library, the counsel of a patient solicitor named Mr. Whitmore in the village, and what the solicitor, when asked, described with visible reluctance as a quite extraordinary natural capacity for financial reasoning. She had, in the 3 years since her father's death, cleared most of the remaining debt. She had renegotiated 2 of the tenancy agreements to better terms for both parties, Mr. Whitmore was careful to note. She had introduced a rotation system on the northern fields that had improved yield by an estimated quarter. Frederick sat with this information for a long time. He did not know precisely what he was going to do with it. He knew only that the woman he had dismissed in a crowded drawing room with a careless sentence was not in any category that he actually cared about dismissible. This was deeply inconvenient. 3 weeks after the Hargrove dinner, his solicitor Aldridge arrived at Pembroke Hall with the kind of carefully composed expression that indicated he was about to say something that required managing. "There has been an inquiry," Aldridge said, settling into the chair across from Frederick's desk, with the gravity of a man bearing dispatches from a front. "From the Sinclair family, specifically from Mrs. Margaret Sinclair, through Mr. Whitmore." Frederick set down his pen. "An inquiry. Regarding," Aldridge coughed, "regarding whether you might be amenable to a formal conversation about the matter of Miss Sophia Sinclair." The office was very quiet. "That is," Frederick said carefully, "unexpected." "I thought so as well, sir, under the circumstances. And yet here you are, and yet here I am." Aldridge folded his hands. Mrs. Sinclair was apparently quite direct. She indicated that she was aware the approach was irregular, given the exchange at the Hargrove dinner, of which the entire county is now aware. I feel I should mention, but that she wished to make clear that her daughter's financial and managerial capabilities were substantive, documented, and available for inspection by any interested party. Frederick looked at his solicitor for a long moment. She offered documentation. She did. I have it here, actually. Aldridge produced a leather folder with the air of a man who had been carrying it the way one carries something unexpectedly significant. Mr. Whitmore sent it along. The estate accounts for the last 3 years, the tenancy agreements, the yield records. Frederick reached across the desk and took the folder. He read for 45 minutes while Aldridge sat in patient silence. The accounts were meticulous. Not merely organized, they reflected a mind that understood not just the recording of numbers, but the relationships between them. The note in the margins of the tenancy renegotiations, in a careful, angular hand that he would come to know very well, indicated a reasoning process that was both analytically sound and practically astute. The yield records showed not just the numbers, but the method behind them. The rotation schedule, cross-referenced with soil notes, was the work of someone who had bothered to understand why things grew the way they grew. He closed the folder. "Tell Mr. Whitmore," Frederick said, "that I will be amenable to a conversation." The conversation happened in the Sinclair parlor on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the fields were brown and the sky carried the particular gray weight of a winter that had decided to arrive seriously. Mrs. Sinclair received him with the determined dignity of a woman who had made peace with necessity without allowing necessity to make a fool of her. Eleanor sat in the corner with needlework she was too obviously not doing, and Sophia sat across the low table from him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carrying the quality of a woman who had prepared for this and intended to get through it with her judgment intact. "Mr. Pembroke." Her voice was even. "I appreciate you making the journey." "Miss Sinclair." He looked at her directly. He owed her that much. "Before we discuss anything else, I want to acknowledge that what I said at the Hargrove dinner was accurate," she said. He stopped. "About you," she continued. "Not about me. You were accurate about what you believed at the time. I have no interest in a man who claims to have been wrong when he wasn't, only to have believed something that subsequent information has revised." A small pause. "So let's not begin with an apology that neither of us has quite earned yet." The needle of something moved through him again, sharp, not entirely comfortable, not entirely unwelcome. "All right," Frederick said. "Then let's begin with what we know." What they knew was this. He needed a wife before December for reasons related to an entailment in his grandfather's will that his solicitor had explained 4 times and that he had managed not to think about until 6 weeks ago. She needed a situation, financial stability, social standing, and the freedom to continue doing what she had been doing for 3 years without the precariousness that attended a household of 3 women in reduced circumstances. What they didn't know was whether those 2 requirements could coexist in the same arrangement. They talked for 2 hours. She asked him about Pembroke Hall's estate management with the directness of a woman who was evaluating a position rather than performing romantic interest. She asked about the current steward, Mr. Croft, how long he'd held the position, what his previous background was, who had appointed him. She asked about the quarterly accounts, about the state of the tenant relations, about the drainage situation on the western fields that she had apparently heard about from a former Pembroke laborer who had since moved to Aldenmere. He answered all of it, honestly. She received his answers the way she received everything, with attention, with the occasional question that indicated she had heard not just his words, but the shape of the information they carried. He asked her near the end of the 2nd hour why she was willing to consider this, given everything. She was quiet for a moment. "Because I am 27 years old, and I have been managing a shrinking estate for 3 years, and I am very good at it, and I am running out of estate to manage." She held his gaze. "And because I have a mother who is 53 and a sister who is 19, and I am the only thing standing between them and a situation that I will not allow." Another pause, smaller. "Not because I cannot bear difficulty. I have borne considerable difficulty, but because I am capable of better and I intend to do better, and a better situation requires resources I don't currently have access to." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a professional context in years. "And the matter of," he began, "affection." She said the word cleanly. No flinching. "I don't require it to begin with. I require respect. I require the freedom to be competent. I require that if I identify a problem and bring it to you with evidence, you will hear it." She tilted her head slightly. "Can you offer those things?" He thought about that for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. "I can offer to try," he said. It was not what she'd asked for. He could see her note the gap. "That's honest at least," she said. They were married 6 weeks later on a gray December morning, with a small party of witnesses, and a contract that Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Aldridge had between them, constructed with the attention to detail usually reserved for the transfer of significant property. Because that was in one sense what it was. Outside the church, as the cold settled around them, and the small party retreated inside for the modest celebration that both families understood to be the sealing of the occasion. Frederick stood for a moment beside his new wife on the stone steps. "Well," Sophia said. The word was quiet, not unhappy, not happy either, measured. "Well," he agreed. She looked at him sidelong. 3 months. "I beg your pardon. 3 months is what I'm giving this arrangement to determine whether it can be something." She pulled her shawl tighter. "I find that 3 months is generally sufficient time to know whether something has the capacity to improve." He looked at her. At the frost in her breath, the level set of her jaw, the eyes that missed nothing and performed nothing. 3 months, he said. "All right." He offered her his arm. She took it without ceremony, without warmth, and without hesitation, and they walked together into the gray December morning, and neither of them knew yet what God had help for and what he didn't. But Sophia Sinclair, who was now Sophia Pembroke, knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was going to find out what was wrong with Pembroke Hall's accounts. Because something was wrong with Pembroke Hall's accounts. She had seen it in this quarterly summary during their conversation. A pattern so subtle that a less attentive eye would have moved past it without pause. A small discrepancy in the timber receipts. A margin that didn't quite align. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. The kind of nothing that very experienced, very careful people worked hard to produce. She tucked the knowledge away behind her measured expression and took her husband's arm and let the December air carry them forward. 3 months. She intended to use every single day. Pembroke Hall was larger than Sophia had allowed herself to imagine. She had prepared herself for grandeur. She had not prepared herself for the particular quality of grandeur that had been neglected not through poverty, but through indifference. The kind of indifference that belonged to a man who had always had too much to notice what any single piece of it was doing. She noticed within the first hour. Mrs. Hatch, the housekeeper, met her at the entrance with the carefully composed expression of a woman taking the measure of a new authority and reserving judgment. 60-odd years gray at the temples, hands that had worked hard for decades and showed it. She curtsied with correct formality and offered to show Mrs. Pembroke to her rooms. "In a moment." Sophia kept her voice pleasant. "Could you show me the household ledger first?" Mrs. Hatch blinked. Just once. "The ledger, ma'am. The household accounts. Running expenses, staff, wages, supply orders. Wherever they're kept." A pause that lasted precisely long enough to be informative. "Mr. Croft manages the estate accounts, ma'am. The household accounts are kept in the... I'd like to see both eventually. The household ledger first, if you don't mind." Mrs. Hatch minded. Sophia could see that she minded. But the woman was too professional to say so, and she retrieved the ledger from the housekeeper's sitting room with the efficiency of someone who had decided to observe before forming a conclusion. Sophia sat at the small writing table and read for 20 minutes, while Mrs. Hatch stood near the door with the patience of a woman who had outlasted 3 generations of Pembrokes and intended to outlast at least one more. The household accounts were fine, meticulous actually. Mrs. Hatch ran a tight operation. Sophia closed the ledger and looked up. "You're very good at this." The housekeeper's expression shifted not much but enough. "I've had 30 years of practice, ma'am." "It shows. I have no intention of changing what works." Sophia stood. "Now show me to my rooms, please, and then I'd like to see the estate office." "Mr. Croft is generally..." "I'm not asking to speak with Mr. Croft today. I just want to see the space." Another pause. Smaller this time. "Of course, ma'am." The estate office was on the ground floor east wing, a solid room that smelled of ink and old paper, and the particular staleness of a space where windows were rarely opened. The desk was massive. The filing system was elaborate. The quarterly ledgers were arranged on the shelf behind the desk in leather-bound order. Sophia stood in the doorway and looked at it all and did not touch a single thing. She was not ready to touch anything yet. She needed to understand the shape of it first. She needed to know what she was looking at before she let anyone know she was looking. She had learned that from 3 years of managing her own family's affairs. The most important intelligence was gathered before the subject knew they were being watched. She thanked Mrs. Hatch and went to her rooms and unpacked her own trunk because the maid assigned to her was 17 and enthusiastic and would have put everything in the wrong place, and Sophia needed her things where she could find them. Frederick came to her sitting room that evening, knocked twice, and entered when she called. He looked around the room at the books already arranged on the small shelf, at the writing materials already organized on the desk, at the general evidence of a woman who had moved into a space and made it functional within 4 hours of arrival. "Are you settled?" A polite question. The kind offered out of duty. Adequately. She was reviewing a letter from Mr. Whitmore regarding the final transfer of the Sinclair property management to a local agent. "Is there something you needed? I wanted to ensure you had everything required." "I have everything I brought with me." She set the letter down and looked at him. "I'd like access to the estate accounts. The full quarterly records, not just the summaries." Something moved across his face, not refusal, but proximity to it. "Those are managed by Croft." "I'm aware. I'd still like to review them, Sophia." He said her name with the careful quality of a man choosing his words from a very limited selection. "Croft has been managing Pembroke's accounts for 11 years. He is experienced, yes." She held his gaze. "I'm not suggesting he isn't. I'm asking to review the records. I reviewed my own family's accounts every quarter. I find it helpful to understand where things stand." "You're not managing your family's estate anymore." The sentence sat between them. She picked it up carefully. "No. I'm managing yours now." She let that land, then added with the precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing, "Which means I have a material interest in its health." Frederick was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who had arrived at a conversational junction without having prepared for it. "I'll mention it to Croft," he said finally. "Thank you." He left. She returned to Mr. Whitmore's letter. She was not, she noted, holding her breath for Croft's cooperation. She was going to have to go around him. The question was, how? The first person who told her anything useful was Thomas Briggs. Thomas was 61, had worked the northern fields of Pembroke Hall for 30 years, and had the weathered quality of a man who had watched things come and go, with the philosophical resignation of someone who understood that the land outlasted everyone who worked it. He touched his hat when Sophia stopped her horse on the lane beside the north field, 3 days into her residence during a morning ride that she had announced to no one, because she didn't need permission to ride on land she was now mistress of. "Good morning." She reined in and looked at the field. "How's the yield been this last season?" Thomas Briggs looked at her with the careful assessment that working men gave to questions from people of quality, weighing the question, weighing the questioner, calculating the risk of honesty against the risk of its absence. "Fair, ma'am," he said. "Fair to middling." "And the season before?" "Similar." "And 10 years ago, when you were using the 2-field rotation?" Thomas Briggs blinked. His chin came up a fraction. "You know about the old rotation, ma'am." I read. "What was the yield then?" A longer pause. He looked at the field. He looked at her. He made a decision. "Better," he said. "Noticeably better. We've been asking Mr. Croft about switching back for 3 years running. He says the current system is more efficient." "More efficient for whom?" Thomas Briggs said nothing. But his silence had a shape to it that Sophia filed away carefully. She thanked him and rode on. By the end of the first week, she had spoken to 4 tenants, 2 field laborers, the miller whose family had ground Pembroke grain for 2 generations, and the blacksmith whose brother-in-law had left Pembroke's employ the previous spring, under circumstances that nobody wanted to describe directly, but that everyone seemed to feel strongly about. None of them told her anything specific. None of them had to. She was assembling a picture from the silences and the careful, not quite answers, and the way certain names made certain faces go carefully, deliberately blank. The name that produced the most careful blankness was Croft's. She finally met him on the 9th day. He was waiting for her in the entrance hall, which told her something immediately, because she had not sent word that she was returning from her morning ride, which meant he had been watching for her, which meant he had decided that the new Mrs. Pembroke required management. Edmund Croft was 52, compact, and possessed of the kind of surface pleasantness that took years to cultivate and concealed something else entirely beneath it. He smiled at her with the warmth of a man who had decided to be charming, which was a different thing entirely from a man who was charming. "Mrs. Pembroke." He bowed correctly. "I apologize that we haven't had the opportunity to meet sooner. I understand you've been getting acquainted with the estate." "I have." She pulled off her riding gloves and handed them to the waiting maid without looking away from Croft. "I've been looking forward to going over the quarterly accounts with you." "Of course." Still warm, still smiling. "Though I should mention Mr. Pembroke generally prefers to review those matters himself, directly. I would hate for you to feel burdened." "I don't feel burdened," Sophia said pleasantly. "I feel interested. There's a difference." She tilted her head. "Shall we say tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock? Croft's smile didn't waver. That was the tell. A genuine smile would have wavered even slightly, the natural micro-adjustments of a face responding honestly to an unexpected development. His stayed perfectly professionally still. "Of course, Mrs. Pembroke, whatever you prefer." She nodded and went upstairs. She sat at her writing desk and wrote down everything she had observed about Edmund Croft in the 10-minute meeting. The stillness of his smile, the speed with which he had invoked Frederick's authority, the way he had framed reviewing the accounts as a burden rather than a right, the fact that he had been waiting for her. She read it back. Then she wrote at the bottom, "He is not afraid of me yet. He thinks I am a wife who needs to be managed. He will give me the accounts he wants me to see." She underlined the last sentence twice. Frederick found her in the library that evening. This was becoming a pattern, her in a room with a document, him appearing in the doorway with the expression of a man checking on a situation he wasn't certain about. "Croft tells me you've requested a meeting to review the quarterly accounts." She looked up from the book she was cross-referencing with a set of notes she'd made from her conversations with the tenants. "I did, Sophia." He came into the room, which was progress of a kind he usually delivered these conversations from the doorway. "Croft has managed those accounts for 11 years without... I know how long he's managed them." Her voice was perfectly even. "Frederick, I am not accusing anyone of anything. I am doing what I have done for 3 years, reviewing financial records, because I find that financial records reviewed carefully tell you things that everything else doesn't." He stopped near the edge of the desk, looking at her notes, not reading them, just registering their existence. "What do you think they'll tell you?" "I don't know yet." She held his gaze. "That's why I need to read them." A silence. "Croft is a trusted employee." "Then the accounts will reflect that." He looked at her for a long moment. Something worked in his expression. Something she was learning to read, this particular quality of a man encountering resistance he couldn't categorize. "I told him to give you whatever you asked for," Frederick said. She hadn't expected that. She didn't let the surprise show. "Thank you." He left. She sat with the words for a moment, then returned to her notes. The meeting with Croft the next morning lasted 3 hours. He gave her the accounts, all of them presented in 4 leather volumes, with the surface confidence of a man who had prepared for precisely this inspection. The records were immaculate, clean, organized, professionally maintained. Too clean. Sophia had learned managing the Sinclair estate through its worst years that genuine financial records had a texture to them. They had corrections, emendations, the small irregularities produced by real transactions in a real world where things didn't always arrive on time or in the correct quantity. They had the organic imperfection of honest work. Croft's records were smooth. Consistently, perfectly smooth. The kind of smooth that took effort. She spent the morning asking questions that were designed to seem routine. Questions about supplier relationships, about how certain costs were calculated, about the timber receipts that she had noticed 3 weeks ago in the quarterly summary Frederick had mentioned. Croft answered everything with the practiced ease of a man who had answered questions before and knew how to answer them without answering them. She thanked him. She asked to borrow the third volume, the one covering the last 18 months of timber and mineral receipts for closer review. A beat. Brief. Almost undetectable. Of course, Mrs. Pembroke. She took it back to the library and spent the afternoon with it, and a set of comparative figures she had reconstructed from memory, from conversations with the mill operator and a map of the Pembroke estate that she had quietly borrowed from the study. By evening, she had found the first thread. It was in the timber receipts, specifically in the variance between the volume logged by the Pembroke foresters and the volume sold to the Ashford timber merchant. A discrepancy of approximately 12% consistent across 14 quarters. Not enormous. Not obvious. The kind of number that looked like natural variation if you didn't know what natural variation in timber yield actually looked like. She knew what it looked like. She sat back and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully. 12% across 14 quarters at the current rate of timber sale from the Pembroke woodland was not an insignificant sum. It was, if her mental arithmetic was correct, somewhere in the range of several £100 per year. The question was not just where that 12% was going. The question was whether this was the only place it was going. She went to Frederick that night. He was in his study predictably, because Frederick Pembroke's study was where he lived the functional portion of his life. She knocked and entered without waiting for an answer, which she suspected was its own kind of communication, and which she could tell registered with him in the slight adjustment of his posture. "I need to tell you something." She closed the door behind her. "And I need you to hear me before you respond." He set down his pen, turned fully to face her. Whatever else he was when he gave his attention, he gave it completely. She had noticed that. It was possibly his best quality. "There is an irregularity in the timber receipts." She laid it out for him, the discrepancy, the consistency across 14 quarters, the calculation of approximate value. She was precise. She used numbers rather than implications. She gave him the evidence the way she would have wanted to receive it, directly, clearly, without embellishment. He listened. His face did very little, which was typical of him, but she was learning to read the things his face did without doing anything. The slight tightening at the jaw. The quality of attention that shifted from professional to something more alive. When she finished, there was a silence. "That could be measurement error," he said. "Consistent measurement error in one direction across 14 quarters is not measurement error. Croft has been with this estate for 11 years. I know. He came with references from Lord Harcastle himself." "Frederick." She waited until he looked at her directly. "I am not asking you to condemn him on what I have now. I am asking you to let me continue looking." A beat. "And I am asking you to not tell him that I am looking." Something shifted in his face that she couldn't entirely read. "You think he'll—" "I think if he knows someone is examining the records carefully, any remaining evidence becomes very difficult to find. Very quickly." She held his gaze. 2 weeks. Give me 2 weeks to complete the review. If I find nothing further, I'll tell you that, and will attribute the variance to measurement error and move on." He was quiet for longer than she expected. "And if you find something further, then you'll need to decide what to do with it." He stood up, moved to the window that overlooked the dark grounds. She watched the set of his shoulders, the particular tension of a man who had built his world on a certain set of certainties, and was being asked to consider that one of them might be false. "Croft is not," he started. "I know it's not comfortable." Her voice was steady, not unkind. "I'm not doing this to be right, Frederick. I'm doing it because it's your estate and your money, and if there's a problem, you deserve to know about it." A long silence. 2 weeks, he said finally, still facing the window. "Do what you need to do." She left him there, standing at the window in the dark, with the particular stillness of a man beginning to suspect that the ground beneath him was not quite as solid as he'd always assumed it to be. She worked methodically. She cross-referenced the timber records against the forester's logs, which she obtained by asking Mrs. Hatch who kept them, which was a young man named Peterson, who worked out of the north barn, and who handed them over with the uncomplicated willingness of someone who had no idea why they might be significant. She pulled the records on the mine lease, a small coal seam on the western edge of the property that Croft had noted as minimally productive in every quarterly report for the past 6 years. She compared it against county records she obtained through a letter to the county land office, signed with her married name, which arrived back within the week. The mine was not minimally productive. According to county extraction records, which the leaseholder was legally required to report, and which Croft had apparently never thought to compare against his own numbers, the mine had been producing at nearly twice the rate reflected in the estate accounts. The difference split she suspected between the leaseholder and the man who had agreed to record the wrong number amounted over 6 years to a sum that made the timber discrepancy look like a rounding error. She sat with that information for 20 minutes. Then she went to find Mr. Whitmore. Not Frederick's solicitor. Her solicitor. The man who had managed the Sinclair accounts with patience and discretion for 15 years, and who was currently also serving at her quiet request 3 weeks ago as her personal legal eyes in this new arrangement. She wrote him a very specific letter. She explained, a complete picture, and she was not yet done building it. The social dimension of her new life was proceeding with its own particular tensions. The county had opinions about Sophia Pembroke. The county had opinions about most things, but it had especially developed opinions about the woman who had spoken back to Frederick Pembroke in the Hargrove drawing room and then improbably married him 6 weeks later. Some of those opinions were curious. Some were skeptical. Most were waiting for her to prove she didn't belong. Waiting for Frederick to demonstrate that he knew she didn't belong. Waiting for the marriage that had started so strangely to resolve itself into something properly legible. Lady Fenwick, the woman who had made her comment at the Hargrove dinner, hosted a Tuesday tea in the 3rd week of January, to which Sophia was invited with the studied politeness of a woman offering a test rather than a welcome. The room contained 8 women, 6 of whom Sophia had met before, and 2 of whom she had not. She wore her best afternoon dress, not her finest, which she was saving, and she arrived without Frederick, which she had decided deliberately. She was not going to be accompanied into these rooms as though she needed escort. The tea began pleasantly enough. The conversation moved through the approved channels: the weather, the upcoming assembly at Maidstone, the matter of the Hargrove eldest daughter's unexpected attachment to a young man from Bath. Sophia contributed at appropriate moments with the ease of a woman who had been managing social situations since she was 14. Then Lady Fenwick turned to her with the bright, pleasant attention of a woman preparing to say something that would require the conversation to hold still. "My dear Mrs. Pembroke, you must tell us how you find Pembroke Hall. Such a substantial responsibility for someone of your previous experience." The pause before previous experience lasted exactly long enough. Sophia set her teacup down with perfect composure. "I find it very well, thank you, though I'll confess the estate accounts required some attention." A small silence. "Oh." Lady Fenwick's tone was the social equivalent of an arched eyebrow. "Surely Mr. Croft manages all of that." "Mr. Croft manages a great deal," Sophia said pleasantly. "I find it useful to understand the full picture myself. My father always said that a house runs best when someone in it understands where everything stands." "How very practical," said Mrs. Ashton, from her position 2 seats down, with a smile that had nothing to do with warmth. "I've always found that practical and useful are closely related." Sophia looked at her directly. "As it happens, I've been finding the Pembroke estate quite well positioned, with a few adjustments." She let that sit. She watched the women in the room absorb it. The implication that she had found something to adjust, that she had the standing to adjust it, that she was not in fact someone whose competence required the room's sympathy. Nobody said anything dismissive after that. The conversation moved on. But the quality of the attention directed toward Sophia shifted subtly, measurably, from waiting for failure to something more uncertain. On the drive home, she was aware that she had passed something. Not a victory. A threshold. The county would not love her quickly or easily. But it was beginning to understand that she was not easily dismissed. She was counting on that. Because she was going to need credibility very soon. She could feel it, the shape of what she was building toward the weight of what she had already found. She found the particular quality of the moment when evidence stopped being a collection of numbers and became a truth that required action. It was coming. The question was whether Frederick would be ready to hear it. She did not know the answer to that yet, but she was running out of weeks to find out. The letter from Mr. Whitmore arrived on a Thursday morning, sealed twice. Sophia recognized the double seal. It was the signal they had agreed upon before she left Aldenmere, his way of telling her that what was inside required privacy before it required anything else. She took it upstairs before the breakfast things were cleared, closed the sitting room door, and read it standing up because she already knew she wasn't going to be able to sit still. It was worse than she'd calculated. Not the timber. Not even the mine. Those were the pieces she had already found, the threads she had handed to Whitmore to follow further. What his letter contained now was the product of 2 weeks of careful inquiry through channels she didn't have access to. Her self-county, land transfer records, merchant accounts, a conversation with the former Pembroke estate solicitor who had retired 4 years ago and who had apparently been carrying a particular discomfort ever since. Edmund Croft had not been stealing from Frederick Pembroke for 6 years. He had been stealing from him for 9. The timber discrepancy and the mine receipts were the visible surface. Beneath them was a systematic pattern of falsified supplier invoices, payments made to 3 companies that Whitmore had been unable to locate in any county trade register, which meant they almost certainly did not exist, which meant the money paid to them had gone somewhere else entirely. Beneath that was a land transfer, a parcel of 22 acres on the southwestern boundary, sold 4 years ago to a buyer Croft had described to Frederick as a local farming family expanding their operation. The buyer was in fact a holding company. The holding company traced through 2 intermediaries connected back to Croft's brother-in-law in Maidstone. The land had been sold at a figure significantly below its assessed value. The difference between what it sold for and what it was worth had, in the normal course of such transactions, simply disappeared. Sophia set the letter down on the desk. She pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. The total figure. Whitmore had estimated carefully, with the conservative qualifications of a man who understood that these numbers would need to withstand scrutiny, was somewhere between £3,000 and £4,000 over 9 years. In a good year, that was a meaningful fraction of what Pembroke Hall generated. Across 9 years, with the compounding effect of underinvestment in fields and infrastructure that should have been maintained, the actual cost to the estate was considerably higher than the stolen sum alone. This was not petty corruption. This was not a man skimming modestly from the edges. This was a man who had looked at Frederick Pembroke's certainty in him and decided that certainty was the most valuable thing he had ever been handed. Sophia picked up the letter again and read the last paragraph a second time. Whitmore had written, "I would strongly advise that before any confrontation occurs, you secure the physical records. The ledger volumes currently in your possession are significant, but the original invoice files and the land transfer documentation held in the estate office will be essential. If Croft becomes aware that an inquiry is underway, those documents are at risk." She put the letter in the locked drawer of her writing desk, pocketed the key, and went downstairs to find her husband. Dr. Frederick was in the East Field with Thomas Briggs and 2 other laborers, reviewing the drainage situation that had been discussed and deferred for at least 3 seasons. She knew this because she had started quietly to track his movements through the household's natural information networks. Not surveillance, but the ordinary awareness of a woman who needed to know where people were in order to do what needed to be done. She intercepted him on his way back to the house. He saw her face and stopped walking. "What's happened?" The question was immediate, direct. Not the careful social query of a man managing a wife. The sharp instinct of a man who had just read something in someone's expression that his body understood before his mind did. "We need to speak privately." Her voice was level. "Now. Not the study. Croft has access to the study. The library. He said nothing. He followed her. She closed the library door and stood in the middle of the room and told him everything. She told it the same way she'd told him about the timber, precisely with numbers, with sources, with the careful architecture of a case rather than an accusation. She told him about the mine. She told him about the false invoices. She told him about the land parcel and the holding company and Croft's brother-in-law in Maidstone. She told him the 9 years. Frederick stood very still throughout. His face did almost nothing. She had learned by now that this was not indifference, it was the opposite. The expression of a man whose emotional responses went so deep that they barely reached the surface. The stillness was the tell. The more still he became, the harder something was hitting. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the fire settling in the grate. 3,000 to 4,000 pounds, he said at last. His voice was entirely flat. That's Whitmore's conservative estimate. The actual cost to the estate accounting for the underfunded maintenance and the below-value land sale is higher. The land. Something moved in his jaw. He sold Pembroke land. To his own family, through intermediaries. Another silence. Longer. I trusted him. The words came out with a quality she hadn't expected. Not anger, not the cold, controlled fury she might have anticipated from a man like Frederick Pembroke. Something rawer than that. Something that sat closer to genuine wound. He came with references. He managed this estate through my father's last years. I trusted Frederick. She kept her voice quiet, steady. He relied on that trust, deliberately. That is the nature of what he did. She waited until he looked at her. This is not a failure of your judgment. This is a failure of his character. He looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't sure he believed her. She wasn't sure she could make him believe her right now. But she needed him functional, which meant she needed him to move forward rather than inward. Whitmore says we need to secure the documents in the estate office before Croft has any reason to suspect we're onto him, she continued. The original invoice files and the land transfer records. Once we have those, the case is complete. Without them, what we have is compelling, but not quite sufficient for a magistrate. A magistrate. He said it like a man testing the weight of a word. This is theft, Frederick. Sustained, deliberate, systematic theft. It requires more than dismissal. His chin lifted. The quality of his stillness changed, hardened, resolved. She watched him choose between the discomfort of acknowledging what had happened and the necessity of responding to it, and she watched the second win over the first. How do we get the documents without alerting him? She had been ready for that question. Croft goes to the village every Friday afternoon. He has done for as long as Mrs. Hatch can remember. She mentioned it in passing last week without knowing why I was asking. Today is Thursday. Tomorrow afternoon, while he is gone, we go into the estate office and remove everything relevant. That's my estate office. Yes, it is. She held his gaze. I need you to be the one to do it. I can tell you exactly what to look for, but it needs to be you, your authority, your right to those records, no question of impropriety. He was quiet again. But this quiet was different from all the others. It was the quiet of a man who was recalibrating something fundamental and who was doing it faster than she had expected. All right, he said. Tomorrow. She released a breath so small it was almost nothing. I'll write to Whitmore tonight. He'll need to be here within the week. Frederick nodded. Then, with a quality in his voice that she hadn't heard before, How long have you known? The first thread, the timber variance, I saw it in the quarterly summary, the night before we were married. She said it simply without apology. Something crossed his face. You saw it before you married me. Yes. And you married me anyway. I married you because the problem in the accounts was not a reason not to marry you. It was a reason to. She watched him process that. Someone had to fix it, Frederick. I was the one who could see it. That seemed relevant. He looked at her across the quiet library, at the woman who had walked into his estate 9 days ago, and had in that time done more to protect it than 11 years of the man he'd trusted completely. She couldn't read what was in his face entirely. But she saw the moment something in it changed. He gave her a short, precise nod, then walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. Thank you. 2 words, low, deliberate, carrying more weight than their brevity suggested. He left without anything further. She stood in the library alone and let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full complicated weight of the last 2 weeks. Then she went to the writing desk and began her letter to Whitmore. Friday came with the tense quality of a day that knew it mattered. Croft left for the village at 2:30, as Mrs. Hatch had said he always did. Sophia watched from the upstairs landing until the sound of his horse on the drive faded entirely. Then she went to find Frederick. He was already at the door of the estate office. He had his own key, a fact that Croft had apparently relied upon Frederick never using, because in 11 years the lock showed almost nowhere from the master's side. They went in together. She moved to the filing system with the certainty of a woman who had spent a week cataloging it in her memory from a single visit. The invoice files for the past decade were in the third cabinet, organized by quarter. She had written Frederick a precise list of what to pull, and he followed it with the focused efficiency of a man who had translated grief and anger into purpose. She worked on the land transfer documentation, the original deeds, the correspondence with the buyer's solicitor, the valuation report that had been deliberately suppressed from the official record. It was there. All of it was there because Croft had never imagined anyone would look, and people who never imagine discovery are always the most completely discovered. 25 minutes. In and out with everything Whitmore had said they needed. Frederick stood in the middle of the room with a stack of documents under his arm and looked around the estate office of a man he had trusted for 9 years, and his face was doing the specific thing that faces do when a version of the world is ending. "Let's go," Sophia said quietly. He followed her out. She locked everything in her own writing desk, her key, her space, her responsibility, until Whitmore arrived. Frederick did not argue this. She thought it cost him something the not arguing, but he did it. Whitmore arrived Monday morning. Howe was 64, meticulous, and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of knowing exactly which problems required which solutions. He shook Frederick's hand with the gravity of the occasion and looked at Sophia with an expression that she recognized. It was the look he had given her 3 years ago when she had presented her first plan for the Sinclair estate reorganization. The look of a man surprised into genuine respect. They spent 4 hours in the library. The three of them with the documents spread across the long table and Whitmore working through them with the systematic attention of a man building a case. He asked questions. Frederick answered some. Sophia answered the rest. At the end of the 4 hours, Whitmore set down his pen and looked at Frederick directly. "This is a serious matter, Mr. Pembroke. What Mrs. Pembroke has assembled here is a pause weighted thorough. The documentation is sufficient in my professional judgment to bring before the county magistrate. The land transfer alone, given the relationship between the buyer and Mr. Croft, constitutes fraudulent conveyance. The invoice irregularities are systematic enough to constitute criminal theft at a scale that carries real consequence." Frederick's jaw was set. What consequence? Transportation potentially depending on the magistrate and the total amount proven. At minimum, imprisonment. Silence. "He has a family," Frederick said. The words came out with a quality that surprised her. Not softness exactly, but the instinct of a man whose sense of justice included costs. "He had yours," Whitmore replied not unkindly. "For 9 years. Another silence. Longer. "What are the options?" Frederick asked. Whitmore laid them out. The full legal route, magistrate formal charges, public proceedings. A private confrontation with demand for restitution and immediate dismissal, foregoing criminal prosecution in exchange for acknowledgement and repayment. Or a combination, the threat of the first to secure the terms of the second. Frederick looked at Sophia. She understood the look. He was not asking for her opinion as a courtesy. He was asking because she had earned the right to have one. "Whatever you decide," she said carefully, "the documentation stays in our possession. That doesn't change regardless of which path you choose." He nodded, turned back to Whitmore. "How long do I have before I need to decide?" "He should be confronted before the end of the week. He's likely noticed by now that certain files have been accessed." Frederick stood, looked out the window. looked at the estate that 9 years of systematic theft had diminished without his knowledge. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. Whitmore nodded and began gathering his papers. But Croft did not give them until tomorrow morning. He came to the library that evening. He knocked correctly formally and entered when Frederick called, and he stood in the doorway with the composed surface of a man who had decided that the best move remaining to him was offense. Sophia was at the writing desk in the corner. She had been there when Frederick had settled by the fire for the evening. She stayed, deliberately. She wanted to be in the room. Croft's eyes moved to her when he entered. She saw the calculation happen, the assessment of whether her presence changed his approach. She kept her face neutral and her hands still on the desk. "Mr. Pembroke." Croft's voice was measured warm, the same surface pleasantness she had encountered on day 9. "I understand there has been some review of the estate records. I wanted to offer my assistance with any questions." Frederick looked up from the chair. His expression was entirely unreadable, which was, Sophia understood, its own kind of answer. "Sit down, Croft." Something flickered in Croft's face. He sat. "I want to ask you about the Harwick parcel. The 22 acres. The land sold to Croft's brother-in-law's holding company." Croft's composure did not break. She had to grant him that. A man of lesser nerve would have flinched. He simply held Frederick's gaze and said with the steady calm of someone who had prepared for this, "The Harwick parcel was sold at fair market value to a farming family looking to expand. I handled the transaction personally to save the estate solicitor's fees." "The buyer was a holding company registered in Maidstone," Frederick said. "The holding company is connected to your wife's brother." The silence that followed had a different texture from all the silences that had come before. This one had weight. The specific weight of a thing that has been concealed for a very long time, meeting the specific weight of being seen. Croft's composure held for 3 more seconds. She counted. Then it shifted. Not collapse. He was too controlled for collapse. But the warmth drained out of his expression, the way color drains from a face when the body decides it cannot maintain the performance. What remained was something harder and more honest and considerably less pleasant. "I see that someone has been thorough." His voice was still level, but the pleasantness was gone entirely. His eyes moved to Sophia. Stayed there. "Mrs. Pembroke, I presume." Frederick's voice when it came was very quiet and very precise. "You will address your comments to..." Croft's gaze moved back. He said nothing. 9 years, Frederick said. The 2 words carried everything, not just the theft, but the trust that had made the theft possible. The years of loyalty performed so convincingly that he had been the last person in the building to understand it was performance. "The estate can afford it," Croft said. And the worst thing about it was not the words, it was that he seemed in some distant recess of himself to believe them. "Pembroke Hall has always been..." "Get out of this room." Frederick's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Tonight, I want you off this property tonight." Croft stood. He looked for a moment as though he might say something further. He looked at Sophia one more time with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between resentment and a cold, reluctant acknowledgement. Then he left. The door closed behind him. The room was completely silent. Frederick sat in the chair with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on the floor, and Sophia remained at the writing desk and did not speak because there was nothing she could say right now that would be better than silence. He had just watched a man he trusted for 9 years reveal himself in 5 minutes. That required its own time, its own space. After a long while, Frederick looked up. "In the morning," he said, "I want to write to the magistrate." She absorbed that. The full legal route. Criminal proceedings. "Are you certain?" "He sold my land." The quiet in his voice was absolute. "To his own family, while collecting his wage and my trust." A pause. "Yes, I'm certain." She nodded. She began to reach for the writing paper. "Sophia." His voice stopped her hand. She waited. "When you saw the discrepancy in the accounts." He didn't look at her yet. "The night before the wedding. You could have said nothing. Walked in knowing and waiting to see if it resolved itself." Finally he raised his eyes. "Why didn't you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because it was your estate," she said. "And it was already mine too, even then. And I don't leave things broken if I can see how to fix them." She held his gaze. "It's not in my nature." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Something shifted in his expression that she had not seen before. Not gratitude, she had seen his gratitude, and it looked different from this. Not respect either, though that was part of it. It was recognition. The slow, particular recognition of a man who has been looking at someone for weeks and has finally understood what he has been seeing. She held his gaze and did not look away. "We should write that letter tonight," she said. "Whitmore will want to deliver it to the magistrate personally in the morning." "Yes." He stood, came to the writing desk, not to take it from her, to stand beside her, which was different. "Tell me what to write." She pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her. She began, and he read every word over her shoulder, and he did not change a single one, and that was the moment, not the wedding, not the timber records, not the confrontation with Croft. That was the moment Sophia Pembroke understood that something real had begun. Not love yet. She was too careful for love yet. But the foundation of something that could bear its weight if they were both willing to build it. She wrote on. The fire settled in the grate. The night pressed cold against the windows. And in the library of Pembroke Hall, the two people who had begun as a business arrangement sat side by side and built the first honest thing between them. Sentence by careful sentence, word by deliberate word. The magistrate's name was Harold Fenwick. Sophia noted it the moment Whitmore spoke it aloud, and she noted the particular stillness that crossed Frederick's face when he heard it too. Harold Fenwick. Lady Fenwick's husband. The same Lady Fenwick who had stood in the Hargrove drawing room 2 months ago and announced in her carrying social voice that God should help any poor soul who had to marry into Sophia's situation. The county was not, it turned out, a large place. Whitmore delivered the letter Monday morning and returned by midday with Fenwick's response. He would receive them Thursday at the county courthouse in Maidstone, and he asked that the relevant documentation be brought in full. Frederick received this news in the entrance hall, read Fenwick's reply twice, and handed it to Sophia without comment. She read it, handed it back. "We should bring Whitmore and the original documents, all of them." "Yes. And you should know, Lady Fenwick will hear about this within the hour of our arrival." He looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was his version of undivided attention. "I know. It doesn't concern you." "What concerns me," Frederick said with a precision that was also a kind of answer, "is that it goes correctly. The rest is noise." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. The week before Thursday moved with the particular quality of time spent in the company of something unresolved, too slow in the quiet moments, too fast in the ones that required action. There was a new estate manager to locate, which Frederick began pursuing through letters to 3 colleagues in neighboring counties, who he trusted with the explicit instruction that references were to be verified independently. Sophia reviewed that list of colleagues before the letters went out. Frederick noticed that she reviewed it. He handed her the list before she asked. That was new. She filed it away without comment, the way she filed everything precisely in the appropriate internal cabinet for reference when needed. There were also the tenants. Pembroke Hall had 14 tenant families, and the word of Croft's departure had moved through the estate, the way words always moved through closed communities, faster than sound, quieter than conversation. Thomas Briggs found a reason to be working near the main drive on Tuesday morning when Sophia came back from her ride, and she stopped, and he touched his hat, and there was a conversation that wasn't quite about anything, but carried everything. "Strange times, ma'am," he offered. "Change often feels strange until it settles." She looked at the north field, the one she'd discussed with him 3 weeks ago, the one with the old rotation that Croft had dismissed. "In the spring, I'd like to start the 3-field rotation again on the northern parcels, if you're willing to walk me through what it looked like before." Thomas Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting a considerable time for a particular kind of permission. "I'd be glad to, ma'am." "Good." She clicked her horse forward. "I'll find you in March." She could feel his surprise at her back as she rode away. It wasn't surprise at the proposal. It was surprise that she already knew enough to make it. She had learned over 3 years of managing her own family's affairs that the people who knew the land best were almost never the people who owned it. They were the people who worked it every single day and were rarely asked what they'd noticed. She intended to ask. Wednesday evening. The night before Maidstone, she found Frederick at his desk with the Croft documentation spread before him, and he was not reviewing it. He was simply sitting with it in the way of a man returning to the site of something that still required understanding. She came in without knocking. She had stopped knocking 2 weeks ago, and he had not remarked upon it, which she took as acceptance. "You don't need to memorize it," she said. "Whitmore knows it well enough for both of us." "I'm not memorizing it." He looked up. "I'm trying to understand how I missed it." She pulled the chair to the other side of the desk and sat down. "You didn't miss it. You trusted someone who had worked very hard to be trustworthy. Those are different failures. The land, Sophia." His voice carried the particular rawness she had heard once before in this same room the night they'd confronted Croft. 22 acres. My grandfather planted those boundary trees, and Croft sold the land beneath them to his own family and brought me the paperwork to sign, and I signed it," she finished quietly. "Because it was his job to bring you paperwork and yours to trust that he had done his job. That is how estates of this size function. They function badly, apparently. They function on trust, which is not the same as functioning badly." She waited until he looked at her. "The problem was not that you trusted. The problem was that there was no secondary system of verification. No one watching the watcher." A pause. "That's fixable." He was quiet for a moment. "You were the secondary system." "I was an accident. I'm suggesting something more deliberate." Something worked in his expression. "What are you suggesting?" She had been thinking about this for the better part of 10 days. "Quarterly reviews, formal ones with the estate manager present, and with me reviewing the accounts independently before and after. A verified inventory of all estate assets renewed annually. Tenant relationships maintained through direct contact, not solely through a manager, so that problems surface through multiple channels, not one." He listened. Really listened. She had learned to distinguish this from the performance of listening, which was what most men offered. "That's a significant additional responsibility," he said. "Yes. For you." "Yes." A silence that was neither uncomfortable nor resolved. And in exchange, his voice was careful. She met his gaze. "In exchange, this estate runs the way it should have been running for 9 years, and neither of us has to discover what a competent thief can do to a family's legacy over another decade." She held the look steady. "I'm not bargaining, Frederick. I'm telling you what I think needs to happen and why. What you do with it is your decision." He looked at the documentation, back at her. Then he gathered the papers into their folder with the precise movements of a man who had made a decision and was closing one chapter in order to open another. "All right," he said. "All right." Maidstone on Thursday was cold enough to mean it. They arrived at the courthouse in the Pembroke carriage, Frederick, Sophia, and Whitmore with the documentation in a locked case on the seat between them. The drive had been largely quiet, which suited all three of them. Sophia had reviewed her notes once, returned them to her bag, and spent the remainder of the journey looking out the window at the winter fields. She was aware without turning to check that Frederick looked at her twice during the drive. She was aware that both times he said nothing. The courthouse was a stone building off the main square, and Harold Fenwick received them in a room that smelled of old paper and good fire. He was 61, with the kind of broad, deliberate authority that came from 30 years of sitting in judgment over other men's disputes. He shook Frederick's hand with the practiced warmth of an equal. He acknowledged Whitmore with professional respect. He looked at Sophia with an expression that she recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man recalibrating his expectation of her role in the proceedings. He recalibrated quickly, to his credit. Within the first 10 minutes, when it became clear that Sophia was not there as Frederick's ornament, but as the person who had built the case, his expression settled into something that she was willing to accept as professional attention. The proceedings took 4 hours. Whitmore presented the documentation in the organized, systematic way of a man who understood that a magistrate's time was finite and his patience for disorder was non-existent. The false invoices, the mine receipts, the land transfer and the holding company records, and the connection to Croft's family in Maidstone. The total calculation conservative and precise. Fenwick asked questions. Good ones. Sophia answered several of them directly, because Whitmore occasionally looked to her when the question touched the analytical work, rather than the legal framework, and she answered with the clarity of a woman who had lived inside these numbers for weeks. At one point, Fenwick set down his pen and looked at her directly. Mrs. Pembroke, you assembled this independently, without legal training. I have practical training, she said, managing my family's estate after my father's death. The analytical method is largely the same regardless of scale. Fenwick looked at Frederick. Frederick returned the look with the level composure of a man who had decided exactly where he stood. The documentation is thorough, Fenwick said, returning to his papers. I'll issue the warrant by end of week. Croft will be located through the county sheriff's office. I assume he has not left the area. As of yesterday evening, he was at his residence in the village, Whitmore replied. Good. Fenwick made a notation. Given the amount involved and the nature of the land transfer, I expect formal charges within the month. I would recommend retaining a barrister for the proceedings, Mr. Pembroke, though given the completeness of this record, I don't anticipate significant challenge. Frederick nodded. Fenwick looked up one final time with the expression of a man who had noted something he intended to remark upon. Mr. Pembroke, you are fortunate in your household. Frederick looked at Sophia, not the social glance of a husband acknowledging a compliment about his wife. The direct, deliberate look of a man acknowledging a specific truth about a specific person. Yes, Frederick said. I am. They did not speak about it on the drive home. Not directly. They spoke about the proceedings, Whitmore's assessment of the timeline, the question of which barrister to retain the practical matter of the estate's financial recovery, given that a portion of Croft's theft was unrecoverable in the short term. They spoke about those things with the focused efficiency of two people who understood that the work ahead was real and required planning. But underneath all of it, in the spaces between the practical sentences, something else was moving. Sophia felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself. Not yet, but the undeniable physical fact that the atmosphere had shifted, and the world on the other side of the change would not be quite the same as the world on this side. She was not certain she was ready for that. She was not certain she was not. It was Lady Fenwick who forced the matter into the open. The dinner invitation arrived Friday morning, 2 days after Maidstone, which meant it had been written and dispatched within hours of Harold Fenwick's return home. Sophia looked at the handwriting on the envelope, and then at Frederick, and then handed it across the breakfast table without comment. He read it, set it down. We don't have to go, he said. Yes, we do. She reached for the marmalade with the practicality of a woman stating an obvious fact. Declining now would look like retreat. We go, we receive whatever she intends to deliver, and we don't retreat. He looked at her for a moment. You're not concerned. I didn't say that. She spread the marmalade with more attention than it strictly required. I'm concerned about several things. I simply don't allow concern to determine my movements. She could feel the quality of his gaze, the particular attention he directed at her. Sometimes the kind that made her feel simultaneously seen and slightly off balance. All right, he said. We go. The dinner was Saturday evening. They arrived to find 14 guests, which was more than Lady Fenwick usually hosted, a fact communicated to Sophia through the entirely reliable channel of Mrs. Hatch, who had worked in this county for 40 years and knew the Fenwick household's patterns with the authority of long observation. 14 guests meant an audience. An audience meant intent. Sophia dressed for it. Not her finest, she had a sense for when finest was appropriate, and this was not it, but her second finest, which was better suited to the message she intended to convey. She needed to look like a woman who had arrived, not a woman who was trying to, The evening began with the surface cordiality of a gathering that contained an undisclosed agenda. Lady Fenwick received them at the entrance with the studied warmth of a woman who had revised her position and was not yet comfortable with the revision. She kissed Sophia's cheek. Sophia accepted it without either warmth or coldness, which was its own kind of message. Dinner proceeded through its courses with the conversation of a table that contained several people who knew about the Croft matter and several who didn't, producing the characteristic conversational tension of information asymmetry in a room where information was a form of social currency. It was over the fish course that Lord Ashton, 3 seats down, a man of 58, with the comfortable authority of old money, turned to Frederick with the directness of a man who had decided to say the thing the table was thinking. "Pembroke, Fenwick tells me you had some trouble with your estate manager." The table's conversations settled slightly. Not completely. The practiced art of looking like one was not listening while listening intently. "Some trouble, yes," Frederick said. "Fellow had been with you a long time. 11 years. 11 years. Damnable business." Ashton shook his head with the genuine sympathy of a man who understood what long-term trust misplaced actually costs. "How did it come out?" Frederick set down his fish fork. The table almost imperceptibly stopped pretending to be engaged in other conversations. "My wife identified irregularities in the accounts in her first week at Pembroke Hall," Frederick said. His voice was clear and unhurried, carrying to every corner of the table. "She assembled the full case with Whitmore's assistance in a fortnight. The matter is now before the magistrate." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a recalibration. Mrs. Ashton, seated 4 places from Sophia, the same woman who had made her remarks at the Hargrove dinner, went very still. "Your wife," Lord Ashton repeated. The word was not doubtful. It was the echo of a man placing new information into an existing framework. "Yes." Frederick looked down the table at Sophia with the level, direct quality that was by now entirely familiar to her, though seeing it deployed publicly in this context was not something she had anticipated. "She saw what I had missed. She protected this estate at a point when I did not yet know it required protection. Not a speech, not an announcement. Stated the way facts are stated by men who have accepted them and have nothing to perform around the acceptance." The table was very quiet. Lady Fenwick, at the head of it, was looking at Sophia with an expression that had moved considerable distance from the one she'd worn in the Hargrove drawing room. It was not yet admiration, but it was genuine reassessment. The look of a woman who had a fixed idea of something and was experiencing the particular discomfort of that idea failing to hold. Sophia held Lady Fenwick's gaze with the composure of a woman who had been assessed by this particular room before and was prepared to let the room arrive at its own conclusions. "Well," Lord Ashton said with the settling finality of a man who had heard enough to form a view. "Well done, Mrs. Pembroke." She inclined her head. "Thank you, Lord Ashton." The dinner continued. On the drive home, the carriage rolled through the dark lanes in silence for some time. Then Frederick spoke. "That was well done. What you did with Lady Fenwick at the end, the way you looked at her." "I didn't do anything with Lady Fenwick." "You held her gaze until she looked away first. That was deliberate." A beat. "Everything I do is deliberate," Sophia said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, with the quality she was coming to recognize as the precursor to something real. "Sophia, I owe you something." She turned to look at him. In the moving dark of the carriage, his face was all shadow and plain. "The morning at the Hargrove dinner," he said. "What I said. We addressed that." "No. You redirected it. There's a difference." He held her gaze across the small space of the carriage. "I said it because Lady Fenwick said it first, and the room expected me to respond, and I made the choice that was easiest in that moment. Not because I had any evidence for it. I said it because you were standing there without armor, and I had armor, and I used it." A pause, precise and deliberate. "That is what I actually did, and I have never said that to you plainly." She was very still. The carriage moved through the dark. The horse's rhythm was steady and indifferent. "You hurt me," she said finally. "Not an accusation, a statement of record. Not because you hated me. I don't think you felt anything particular about me at all. That was the thing of it. She looked at him directly. You hurt me because I wasn't real enough to you to be hurt deliberately. I was just convenient for the moment. The words landed in the silence between them, with a weight she had carried for 2 months and was setting down now, not out of anger, but out of the simple necessity of truth, in a space that had become slowly, and without announcement, a space where truth was possible. His face did not compose itself. It stayed open in a way that was new, vulnerable, in the specific way of a man who has recognized something about himself that he cannot unrecognize. Yes, he said. That is exactly what I did. She held his gaze. I am not asking for your forgiveness, he continued. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for that yet. I'm telling you what I know was true, because I think you deserve to have me say it plainly. A pause. And because I don't want to be the kind of man who knows a thing is true and doesn't say it. Sophia looked at him for a long time. Outside, the dark lanes of Kent moved past. The cold pressed at the carriage windows. The world continued its ordinary business. That is the most honest thing you have said to me, she said, since we met. It should not have taken this long. No. She held his gaze. It should not. Another silence. Different from the others. Not the silence of two people avoiding something. The silence of two people sitting with something real and not yet knowing what to do with it. I am trying, he said finally. The two words were quiet and entirely unperformed. I want you to know that. Whatever it looks like from where you're standing, I am trying. She thought about the way he had handed her the list of colleagues before she asked. The way he had stood at the writing desk in the library and read every word of the letter to the magistrate over her shoulder and changed nothing. The way he had looked at Harold Fenwick's question in the courthouse and answered it with her name. I know, she said. She did not say more than that. It was not the moment for more. But the way she said it, steady, clear, with the particular quality of a woman who did not say things she didn't mean, carried enough. He heard it. She could tell the way something in his shoulders shifted. Not relaxation exactly. Release. The specific release of a man who has been holding something tightly for some time and has been told at last that he may set it down. The carriage rolled on through the dark. They sat in the space between where they had been and where they were going, and neither of them named it yet, because some things needed to find their own form before they could bear naming. But it was there. Quietly, stubbornly built from documentation and December mornings, and 2 months of a woman who didn't leave things broken, and a man who was learning that strength and pride were not the same thing and had never been. It was there, and Pembroke Hall waited ahead of them in the dark, lit in the lower windows, carrying the particular patience of old buildings that have witnessed many arrivals, and know that the ones that matter tend to come quietly. February arrived the way it always did in Kent, without ceremony and with considerable intention. The cold that had settled over the county since December showed no interest in leaving, and Pembroke Hall responded to it the way old houses respond to things they have outlasted before, with the creaking patience of deep timber and the particular warmth of fires built by people who understood that warmth was not a luxury, but a decision made repeatedly every morning against the indifference of the season. Sophia made that decision every morning, not just the fires, the estate, the tenants, the accounts that she now reviewed with the formality that she and Frederick had agreed upon, quarterly then monthly, when the recovery work demanded closer attention, then weekly in February, when the new estate manager arrived, and the full scope of what 9 years of Crofts management had actually cost the land became something they could finally measure precisely. The new manager was the man named Daniel Hare. 44, from a farming background in Lincolnshire, with calloused hands, and the kind of straightforward competence that announced itself through action rather than manner. He had come recommended by Frederick's colleague in the north, and his references had been verified by 2 independent parties, a condition that Frederick had stated plainly from the first letter, and which Hare had met without complaint. A man who didn't balk at verification, Sophia had observed quietly, was a man with nothing to hide. She had interviewed him herself the morning after Frederick had sitting across the estate office desk with the account books open between them and asking questions that went considerably deeper than his previous employment history. Hare had answered all of them with the patient directness of a man who was accustomed to being tested by circumstance, and had learned that the tests worth passing were the ones that asked something real. At the end of the interview, he had looked at her across the desk and said with the uncomplicated frankness of someone who had decided honesty was the most efficient policy, "You're the one who found the last man out." It was not quite a question. "Yes," Sophia said. Hare nodded with the expression of a man filing information in the appropriate column. "Good," was all he said. "Then we'll get along." They did. The legal proceedings against Edmund Croft concluded in the third week of February. The barrister. Frederick had retained a precise, formidable man from London, named Graves, had assessed the documentation that Sophia and Whitmore had assembled, and made the same observation that Harold Fenwick had made, though with the clipped economy of a professional whose time was expensive. This is thorough work. He had then set about building the formal case with the mechanical efficiency of a man who understood that emotion and law occupied separate rooms and should be kept that way. Croft had retained his own counsel. The defense, such as it was, had attempted to argue measurement error on the timber accounts and a clerical misunderstanding on the mine receipts, both of which collapsed under the weight of the documentation's consistency across 9 years and 400-odd pages of precisely cross-referenced evidence. The land transfer was the thing that ended it. When Graves placed the holding company records on the table and traced the connection to Croft's brother-in-law through 2 intermediaries in Maidstone, Croft's counsel had gone quiet in the particular way of a man who has just understood that the case he was paid to make does not in fact exist. Croft was convicted on 3 counts of fraudulent misappropriation. The sentence was 7 years transportation. Frederick received the news in the estate office, standing with Sophia across the desk from him and Whitmore's written summary of the verdict in his hand. He read it twice, set it down. Was quiet for a long moment in the particular way she had learned, meant that something was working through him that required its own time. "It's done," she said. "Yes." His voice was level. "I keep thinking about the morning I signed the Harwick parcel transfer." Croft brought it in with the other weekly correspondence. "I signed it between a letter to my tenant about the mill lease and a note to my tailor." He looked up. "I signed away my grandfather's land in 30 seconds between a mill lease and a tailor." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "And now you have it back." He looked at her. "The land," she clarified. "Whitmore confirmed yesterday that the fraudulent conveyance ruling means the transfer is voided. The Harwick parcel reverts to the estate." Something moved across his face, not the release she might have expected, but something more complicated. "He worked those fields for 30 years, and never—" He stopped. "Frederick." She waited until he met her eyes. "You can grieve what was done and still move forward. Those are not opposing directions." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, then picked up his pen and returned to the correspondence on his desk. She understood. That was enough for now. The first real sign that something had changed, not in the estate, not in the legal proceedings, but between them, came on a Thursday morning in the third week of February, when Sophia was in the middle of reviewing Hare's first independent assessment of the Northfield drainage, with the focused attention of a woman who preferred to understand something completely before she made a decision about it. Frederick came into the library without knocking. She looked up. He came to the desk and set a letter in front of her without preamble. "From Lord Harcastle," he said. "He's requesting an introduction to whoever designed the tenancy renegotiation framework I mentioned at the Ashton dinner last month." He looked at her directly. "I told him it was you. He's asking if you'd be willing to consult on a similar situation on his Wiltshire estate." Sophia looked at the letter, at Frederick, at the letter again. "You mentioned the tenancy renegotiations at the Ashton dinner." Lord Ashton asked how the estate recovery was progressing. "I told him the truth, that we'd implemented a new tenant relationship framework designed by my wife, based on the work she'd done on the Sinclair estate before our marriage, and that yield projections for the spring were already significantly improved." He held her gaze. "Because that is what happened." She absorbed that. The letter. The specific deliberateness of a man who had not only acknowledged her work in private, but attributed it publicly by name to a peer of his own standing. "I don't know if I have time for Harcastle's estate this spring," she said carefully. "We're still in the middle of the Pembroke recovery." "I told him that too. He said he'd wait until summer if necessary." She looked at the letter again. He'd wait. Apparently word travels. She set the letter down. Something was moving in her chest that she was not yet going to name, because naming it felt premature, and she was above everything. A woman who did not make claims before she had the evidence to support them. "I'll write to him," she said. "By the end of the week." Frederick nodded, turned to go. "Frederick." He stopped, turned back. She chose the words with care. "Thank you for saying it was mine." He held her gaze with the level directness that was by now entirely his. "It was yours. I don't take credit for other people's work." A beat smaller. "I used to take credit for the estate's success without understanding whose work I was actually standing on. I'm not going to do that again." He left. Sophia sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and returned to Hare's drainage assessment, because the Northfield was not going to manage itself, and because she had learned over 30 years of living that the moments that mattered most were rarely the dramatic ones. They were the quiet ones, the ones that announced nothing, the ones where a person simply did the next right thing and let the accumulation of right things become over time something worth naming. The Harcastle matter was not the only thing traveling in the county. Word of what Sophia had done not the story, as Lady Fenwick might have told it. Not the version that centered Frederick's response to betrayal, but the specific factual version of a woman who had walked into an estate and seen in her first week. What 9 years had not surfaced, that word had its own movement. Quieter than gossip, more durable. It reached, among other places, the Aldenmere Ladies' Reading Society, where Eleanor Sinclair was an enthusiastic member, and where in the second week of February, a woman named Mrs. Gorst had leaned across the tea table and told Eleanor with the particular combination of admiration and amazement that people deploy when they are revising an opinion, they had held firmly that her sister was apparently the most capable woman in Kent. Eleanor had written immediately to Sophia in the breathless register that she used when she was genuinely overwhelmed. "I have had 17 people tell me 17 versions of the same story this week, and every version agrees on one thing: that you are extraordinary." "Are you extraordinary? I feel I should have known sooner." Sophia had written back, "You have always known. You simply assumed it was ordinary because it was mine." She did not mention the letter to Frederick. Some things were private, not because they required concealment, but because they required their own space. What she did mention one evening in late February, when they had fallen into the habit of spending the hour after dinner in the library, with their respective correspondence, and the comfortable silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill space, was her mother. "My mother would like to visit," she said without looking up from the letter. "In March, with Eleanor, for a fortnight." Of course. No hesitation, no qualification. She did look up then. "You don't need to consider it." "What's to consider? This is your home. Your family is welcome in it." He returned to his correspondence. "Write and tell them to come." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then looked back at her letter. "I will," she said. "Thank you. Stop thanking me for ordinary things." She almost smiled. She was not quite ready to let him see it yet. "I'll stop thanking you when ordinary things stop surprising me." A pause. She could feel the quality of his attention shift the way it shifted when something she said required a recalibration. "Fair enough," he said quietly. March came with the first genuine warmth of the approaching spring, and with it, Thomas Briggs in the Northfield, and Sophia beside him, walking the boundary lines of the proposed rotation change, with the focused attention of two people who cared about the same thing from different but entirely compatible angles. She had brought a notebook. She always brought a notebook. Briggs had begun in the 3 weeks since they'd started these field consultations to bring his own a battered thing, that had she suspected been sitting unused in his cottage for years, brought out now because someone had asked him what he knew and had meant the question. "The western corner is the trouble spot," he said, stopping at a point where the field dipped slightly toward the old drainage ditch. "Always been. The yield drops off here because the water sits too long in spring. Old Mr. Pembroke, the elder one, Frederick's grandfather, he used to keep it in pasture. Never tried to grow grain here." Sophia looked at the ground beneath her feet. "What if we put it back to pasture, rotate the dairy herd onto it in spring grain in the drier sections, fallow in the north quarter in alternating years?" Briggs was quiet for a moment. The good kind of quiet, the kind where a person was genuinely thinking, rather than merely pausing. "That could work," he said. "Better than what we've been doing." He looked at her sidelong. "You know, ma'am, most folks who ask questions about land don't actually know what they're asking about. They ask, and then they tell you what they already decided." "I don't know what I don't know," she said simply. "That's why I ask." He nodded, made a notation in his battered book. "March is the right time to make the change. If we're doing it, we should start this week. Then let's start this week." She was walking back toward the house notes in hand when she saw Frederick coming across the field toward her. He had his hat in his hand and the spring light on his face, and he moved with the ease of a man who had in the last 2 months stopped moving as though the ground were something to be managed and started moving as though it belonged to him in a different, more honest way. He fell into step beside her. Briggs looked pleased, he observed. He had good ideas that nobody had bothered to ask for. That tends to make people pleased when you finally do. "I should have asked him years ago." "Yes." "You're not going to soften that?" "No." She glanced at him. "But you're asking now. That's the part that counts." I was quiet for several steps. "I've been thinking about what Lord Harcastle said, about the tenancy framework. There are 2 other estates in the county with similar recovery situations. Ashton mentioned one last week, and Whitmore told me about another near Faversham." She looked at him. "What about them?" "I think you should consult on them. Both. If you're willing." He held her gaze. "Not as a favor to me. Not as the wife of Frederick Pembroke, who happens to have a useful skill. Formally. With Whitmore documenting the terms and the compensation." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "Compensation," she repeated. "You are providing a professional service," Frederick said, with the directness of a man who had thought about this carefully, and arrived at a conclusion he was going to state plainly, regardless of its reception. "The fact that you are my wife does not mean your work is included in the marriage contract without additional consideration." Whitmore agrees. The 2 are separate. The spring light was warm on her face. The field around them was starting to show the first green at the edges, the stubborn early green that came before anything could be properly called growth. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "You talked to Whitmore about this?" "Last week." "Before you talked to me?" "I wanted to know whether it was legally straightforward before I proposed something I couldn't actually deliver." A beat. "It is. It's entirely straightforward." She looked away, looked at the field, at the distant figure of Thomas Briggs, making his notations in his battered book. Something was moving through her that was too large and too complicated. For the moment, it was in the accumulation of 3 years of managing by herself, and 3 months of managing beside a man who had started by dismissing her and had arrived step by careful step at this field in March, proposing formal compensation for her work, as though it had always been the obvious thing to propose. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. "Have Whitmore draw up the terms." "I will." They walked back toward the house together. After a moment, Frederick said without looking at her, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "I answer everything honestly." "I know." A pause. Is this—" He stopped. Started again with the quality of a man who was not accustomed to not knowing how to say something, and who was refusing to let that unfamiliarity be an excuse for not saying it. "Are you content here, not managed, not tolerated, actually content?" She took her time with the answer. "I am more than I was," she said, "and less than I expect to be." She glanced at him. "That's the honest answer." He nodded. What would more require? The question landed with the particular weight of a genuine inquiry, a man who actually wanted to know who was asking, not to perform concern, but to understand what was needed and then do it. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. Time, she said. Mostly time. And for you to keep doing what you've been doing, which is asking before deciding and attributing work to the person who did it, and not retreating into the easy version of yourself when things are difficult. She looked at him steadily. Can you keep doing that? Yes. No qualification. No hesitation. She held his gaze. Then more is coming. The dinner at the Harcastle estate in April was not a dinner at the Harcastle estate. It was, though nobody announced it as such, the moment the county formally revised its understanding of what Sophia Pembroke was. Harcastle had invited 18 guests. Half of them had estates or interests connected to the kind of work Sophia was now formally undertaking through the consulting arrangement Whitmore had drawn up in March. The other half were there, Sophia suspected, because Harcastle was a sociable man who liked an audience for things he found interesting, and he apparently found Sophia Pembroke interesting. She sat at dinner between Lord Harcastle and a man named Sir Edmund Vane, who owned 3,000 acres in Sussex, and who had been told by Harcastle in the letter of invitation that he absolutely should speak with Mrs. Pembroke about the drainage situation on his southern fields. Vane had the look of a man who had come prepared to be politely unimpressed and had been caught off guard. You reconfigured the Pembroke rotation in a single season. His tone was careful, not dismissive, but the particular carefulness of a man ensuring he had heard correctly before he revised his position. We began in March, Sophia said. The first results will be visible by harvest. The full benefit takes 3 years. She looked at him directly. That's the honest timeline. Anyone who tells you a rotation change produces immediate results is telling you what you want to hear. Vane blinked. Then slowly he smiled, the genuine kind, not the social kind. My current estate manager tells me what I want to hear with remarkable consistency. I know, it's a common problem. She kept her voice pleasant. What does your drainage map look like on the southern fields? They talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, Vane had asked Whitmore's address from Frederick across the table with the directness of a man who had made a decision. Frederick gave it without a flicker of surprise, as though the entire table inquiring after his wife's solicitor's contact details were simply the natural condition of an April dinner in Kent. Lady Fenwick, seated 3 places down, watched all of this with an expression that Sophia did not look at directly, but noted in her peripheral vision with the calm of a woman who understood that some observations were best made from the corner of the eye. After dinner in the drawing room, Lady Fenwick made her way to Sophia's side with the deliberate movement of a woman who had something she had decided to say and intended to say it before she changed her mind. Sophia waited. Mrs. Pembroke. Lady Fenwick's voice was lower than her usual register. The carrying quality gone, replaced by something more private and considerably more genuine. I owe you an apology that is somewhat overdue. Sophia looked at her. Lady Fenwick, what I said at the Hargrove dinner, and what I contributed to that evening. I was unkind in a way that I would not have been had I known. She stopped, began again. Had I been paying better attention? Had you taken me seriously? Sophia said. Quiet, not unkind, simply accurate. Lady Fenwick absorbed that. Yes. Had I taken you seriously? She looked at Sophia with the particular expression of a woman of 63, who has sufficient character to be uncomfortable in her own wrong and sufficient courage to say so aloud. I am taking you seriously now. I know. Sophia looked at her steadily. Thank you for saying it. It was enough. Lady Fenwick inclined her head with the dignity of a woman who had done what was required and knew it. They moved apart. The drawing room continued around them. Across the room, Frederick caught her eye. She gave him nothing dramatic, no smile, no signal. Just the level, quiet acknowledgement of 2 people who had been in the same room for long enough to communicate across it without words. He looked back at her with those dark, level eyes. And she saw in them something she had not seen in the Hargrove drawing room 4 months ago, when she had stood before a man who looked through her. He saw her. Fully. Clearly. Without the convenient arrangement of vision that filtered out anything requiring more than management. She held his gaze for one moment, then turned back to the room. The evening they came home from Harcastle's late, the April dark soft around the carriage, the horses steady on the familiar road. Frederick did not go to his study. He followed her to the library. She had become accustomed to the pattern of the evening, each of them to their respective work. Work the comfortable parallel quiet that had developed over months. So when he came in and did not sit at his own usual place, but pulled a chair to her side of the desk, she looked at him with genuine curiosity. "There's something I want to say," he said, "and I want to say it now while it's clear." She set her pen down, gave him her full attention. "All right." He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "I have been thinking about the Hargrove dinner for 4 months. Not because I regret it in the general way a person regrets a social error, but because I have been trying to understand who I was in that room that I could have said what I said." A pause. "I was a man who believed that how much a person was worth could be measured by what they visibly possessed, and anything that wasn't immediately visible didn't count." Sophia was very still. "I looked at you," Frederick continued, "and I saw no fortune, no connections, no obvious consequence. And I decided in the space of 30 seconds that you were less. And I said so out loud." His voice was steady. This was not confession for the relief of it, she understood. This was account-giving, precise and intentional. "And then I watched you answer me. And something happened that I did not admit to myself until considerably later I was—" He paused, finding the exact word, struck. Not charmed. Struck. The way you are struck by something you did not expect and cannot immediately categorize. She held his gaze. "And then I spent 3 weeks finding reasons to make inquiries about the Sinclair estate," he said, "which I have also never admitted plainly. I told myself it was due diligence. It was not. It was that I could not stop thinking about a woman who had answered me in a room full of people without armor and without retreat, and without asking anyone's permission." The library was very quiet. "Frederick," she said. Her voice was careful, not guarded careful. The carefulness of a woman approaching something real and wanting to handle it without damage. "What are you telling me?" He looked at her with the direct. That was the most consistent thing about him. The quality that had been there even at the Hargrove dinner when everything else was wrong. The absolute unflinching directness of a man who once he decided to look at something, looked at it fully. "I am telling you that I married you for practical reasons, and I find that 4 months into this arrangement, the practical reasons are the least of why I am glad I did." He did not look away. "I am telling you that I respect you in a way that I have not respected anyone in my professional or personal life. I am telling you that this house—" A brief pause. "This house is not what it was before you came into it. And I am not who I was. And I know which of those changes I am responsible for, and which I have you to thank for. And I don't want to be a man who knows that and keeps it to himself out of the habit of keeping things to himself." Sophia sat with that for a long moment. She had been managing her own internal cartography for 4 months, noting the evidence, cross-referencing it, refusing to come to conclusions before the data was sufficient. She had watched a man who began as a stranger become someone she trusted, and then someone she relied upon, and then in the specific compound way of things that build through accumulation rather than declaration. Someone she had quietly, completely, and without fanfare, come to love. She had not said it. She had not been certain it was time. She was certain now. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you, the whole time. I see everything, Frederick, you know that by now." She held his gaze with the steady, clear quality of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and had long ago decided that her own judgment was the only currency she fully trusted. "I have seen a man who started with pride and found his way to honesty, who started with contempt and found his way to respect, who started with a wife he didn't choose and found his way to—" She stopped. "Let the word find its own weight, to this. Is this enough?" His voice was quiet, not uncertain, genuinely asking. "It's more than I calculated for," she said, "and I calculated carefully." Something in his face changed, not broke open, Not collapsed into anything dramatic. Simply settled. The way a thing settles when it has found its proper level. He reached across the desk and placed his hand over hers. She turned her hand and held it. They sat in the library of Pembroke Hall in the April dark, with the accounts and the correspondence and the evidence of a household running as it should. And outside the window, the north field was already showing the first green of the new rotation, and Thomas Briggs would be up at dawn to check the drainage, and Daniel Hare had his weekly report ready for the morning meeting, and Mr. Whitmore had 3 new consulting inquiries on his desk from neighboring estates, and Sophia Pembroke's name was attached to all of them. The spring assembly in Maidstone came in May. The county attended in force because it always did, and the room was warm and bright and crowded with the particular energy of people who had survived another winter and were ready to celebrate the fact. Frederick and Sophia arrived together, which was not unremarkable. They had attended every social engagement together since January, but the way they arrived had changed in a quality that the observant people in the room noted without being able to name precisely. They did not perform ease, they simply had it. Lord Ashton found them near the edge of the dancing and claimed Frederick for a brief conversation about a county drainage commission that was forming. Sophia released his arm without ceremony and accepted a glass of wine from a passing tray and turned to find Mrs. Vane. Sir Edmund's wife recently introduced standing nearby with the expression of a woman who had come prepared to be friendly. They talked about the Sussex fields for 20 minutes and about books for 10. And Sophia learned that Mrs. Vane had opinions about agricultural philosophy that she had never had anyone ask about. And by the end of the conversation, something had been established between them that was the beginning of what might over time become genuine friendship. It was during the third dance that Lord Ashton, who had retained Frederick beside him with the determined sociability of a man with more opinions than available listeners, leaned back slightly and looked across the room toward Sophia and said without particular preamble, "Your wife has made quite an impression on this county, Pembroke. Quite an impression." Frederick looked at Sophia. She was in conversation with Mrs. Vane. Her face animated, her hands moving slightly, the way they moved when she was engaged by something she actually found interesting. She was not performing. She was not managing the room. She was simply present entirely herself in a way that had taken him 4 months to fully understand the rarity of. "Was your marriage everything you expected?" Ashton asked. The question was genial, not intrusive, the question of a man making conversation. "When you went into it, was it what you expected?" Frederick watched his wife across the room. "No," he said. Ashton glanced at him. "No, it was far more than I deserved." He said it simply, without self-deprecation and without performance, as a statement of known fact. "I went in expecting a practical arrangement that suited 2 people's circumstances. I got—" He paused, finding the right word, the way he had learned over 4 months of a woman who used language precisely to find right words, a partnership. Of a kind I didn't know to expect, because I had not understood before what a partnership of equals actually looked like. Ashton was quiet for a moment. Then, with the nod of a man who has heard something true, "You're a lucky man, Pembroke." "Yes," Frederick said. "I am." Sophia looked up from across the room. At that moment, the specific instinct of a woman who had spent her life being watched and had developed a corresponding sensitivity to attention directed her way. She caught Frederick's eye across the distance. He did not look away. She held his gaze for 1 moment, 2, with the clear, unguarded quality of a woman who had stopped measuring what she showed him against what she might lose by showing it. Then she turned back to Mrs. Vane and continued the conversation. And Frederick Pembroke stood beside Lord Ashton in the warm May Assembly Hall, and understood with the settled certainty of a man who had arrived somewhere after a long time of not knowing he was traveling, that the woman across the room had not simply saved his estate. She had saved him from the version of himself that would have spent the rest of his life mistaking pride for dignity and management for love, and the absence of challenge for peace. She had walked into a house that was running badly and fixed what was broken. And then, without being asked, without being thanked early enough or well enough or often enough, she had begun quietly, deliberately, in the way she did everything to fix him too. I was not a finished project. He understood that. She would be the first to say so with the honest directness that was the quality he had feared at the Hargrove dinner and had come to need the way he needed the land beneath him constantly, without drama, as the simple condition of standing upright. He was not finished, but he was better. And Sophia Pembroke, who had walked into a drawing room in October with a pressed gown and no armor and a mind like a precision instrument and a spine that did not bend to the convenient cruelties of small people, had known before he did that better was possible. She had simply waited for him to figure it out. And now he had. And in Pembroke Hall's North Field, the new rotation was taking hold in the spring soil, green and deliberate and built to last exactly like everything else she touched.